Coach Lee here, bringing you another video on trying to help you become the best ultra runner possible. And today I want to talk about strength training. Now, I did chat a little bit about strength training in one of my videos on the How to Build an Ultra Runner series as I was training for my last 50k race. But I wanted to take some time now to explore some of those concepts in a bit more detail, potentially kind of invoke some more questions from you guys, especially because that was one of my earlier videos, and I found now that since I've got a few more subscribers and a bit more engagement, that obviously I'm getting more questions and feedback, which is absolutely great. By the way, please keep that coming. I absolutely love answering questions and trying to help people with their specific needs. So I thought I would just do a bit more of a dedicated strength training for ultra running video, and then try and hopefully give you a bit more clarity and practical takeaway that you can use in your training. So first up, why as a runner do we need strength training? What's the point? You will probably see that some of the top runners out there do strength training, some of them don't. Some of them may do something in between. Some of them may do it at different times of the year. What's it all about? Well, the reason that we want to utilize strength training, and I touched on this in my last video on how to build endurance, one of the main components that road runners like to utilize it is to help improve run economy. Whilst the research is still kind of in its infancy in determining run economy's benefit to ultra running, especially trail running, mountain running, etc., we do know that strength training can help improve run economy, i.e. the efficiency at which you run and costing you less energy per foot strike. That's one of the reasons why strength training is quite beneficial to runners. But a bit more specific to ultra running then, there's a few main concepts. Number one is that it can reduce the risk of injury and reduce the risk of overload on muscles and joints, because we know that strength training or resistance training, however you want to call it, can obviously build more resiliency in muscle tissues, build more resiliency around joints, ligaments and tendons. That's been a fact for years and years and years. And that obviously goes some way in helping give us a little bit more resiliency when it comes to ultra distance, especially when it comes to running on rugged terrain, uphills, downhills, etc. We also know that we cause a lot of mechanical damage or muscle damage when we do things like descending in ultra running or in training, and we can condition our muscles to be able to withstand that a little bit more. Yes, obviously running is part of that, but we can also do a bit of that resiliency work in the gym as well. The main reason that I would suggest that strength training is of benefit to you is for longevity. Regardless of the impacts on running, we know that strength training is one of the best ways to help reduce aging. We know it's one of the best ways to maintain decent blood flow, muscle tissues to help you stay self-sufficient as you get older, to maintain the integrity of joints and ligaments and tendons, because we know that they degrade as we get older, unfortunately. We also know that things like in men, that the calf muscles and the Achilles and stuff are more susceptible to injuries as well as we get older. So we're almost bulletproof in ourselves to be able to resist that as much as possible over time. So even if you're not necessarily bought into, well, it's not going to improve my running, which it would, just the fact that it helps increase longevity, which is going to allow you to continue to run later in your life, should be a big enough reason to understand why strength training needs to be incorporated into your running program. So that's the kind of the why. The other bit I wanted to discuss then on top of that is how we go about incorporating strength work into our training program. What do the sessions look like? What are the sets and reps? What are the rest periods? All that good stuff. Now, before we do that though, we need to understand what strength is. What is the definition of strength? When we break it down to its simplest form, we can say that strength is force production, i.e. the most amount of force that you can produce, either if we're looking at a single repetition, obviously multiple repetitions, hundreds of steps, thousands of steps, etc. It still all relates to force production, you being able to apply a force against a resistance, whether that's the ground, whether it's a barbell or a dumbbell. So when we talk about that definition, we know straight away then that's going to kind of steer us towards heavier weights, or heavy to moderate weight, shall we say, and lower rep schemes. So those that are throwing weight around for 20, 30 reps at a time, or doing some sort of high intensity circuit where they're able to smash out reps for a minute or so, that's not strength. Okay, you are not getting stronger by doing that after a couple of weeks or so. Unless you're then increasing the weights, then yes, obviously you will get stronger. But in terms of applying maximal amounts of force, you're obviously not getting as much benefit as if you were going heavier and doing it for less reps and doing it in a bit more of a controlled environment where you're not doing it as a part of a group exercise session or a HIIT workout or something like that. So if we're trying to adhere as much as we can to the definition of strength, like I said, then we need to look at competency with free weights, resistance machines, barbells, all that stuff. Yes, bands and kind of body weight and stuff will have their place in the beginning depending on your ability. If you're new to all this, then of course moving your own body weight competently or introducing some bands as a form of external resistance in the short term is obviously going to still build some strength and just some competency and movement, which isn't a bad thing. However, remember, just like with running, if we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again, we'll plateau, we won't adapt. Remember, to progress forward in any element of fitness, we need to apply some of those basic principles such as progressive overload. When we look at running volume, when we go up by 5 miles from one week to the next, that's progressive overload. You're adding more volume to your training, therefore your body's going to adapt to that increased volume and improve fitness. The concept is the same for strength training. If you want to get stronger, you need to apply some form of progressive overload. If you've got 2 resistance bands at home, once you've used your thickest resistance band for a week or two, you've exhausted probably the benefits of that in terms of getting you stronger. Yes, it will obviously maintain that level of strength, but realistically, when we look at running injuries or you go to a physio and they test specific muscle groups or areas for weaknesses, you could probably find that you've done lots of band work at home, body weight and stuff, and you've still got these weaknesses or these imbalances or just the inability to produce force in certain areas. And that's where then external load comes into play. Like I said, using resistance machines, using dumbbells, using barbells. You don't have to be throwing free weights around. Resistance machines, if you're not that into the gym, is obviously going to be a great port of call. However, if you don't like going to the gym, that's where then maybe looking at free weights such as dumbbells, kettlebells, especially if you buy yourself an adjustable dumbbell set where you can then obviously change the load from pretty much from anything from 2.5 kilos up to potentially 20 kilos on an adjustable dumbbell and have a pair of those. For most runners, that's going to be enough external load, potentially up to 40 kilos for most movements for you to get some decent amount of strength then to help with your running. So that's strength as a sort of definition and the concept of that we need to apply that progressive overload to get stronger in some form. Yes, obviously there is a point of diminishing returns, i.e. you don't need to be getting jacked and super strong and all that sort of stuff if you don't want to. However, don't think that by getting stronger or building a little bit of muscle that it's going to make you slower. I ran the fastest I've ever ran after I started to incorporate deadlifts and squats into my training. And I'm not just talking about a 16 kilo kettlebell, I'm talking about squatting up to 100, 120 kilos for reps, deadlifting 140, 150, 160 kilos. I got the fastest I've ever been and the most resilient I've ever been once I started to incorporate those exercises as examples into my training regimen. And I've completed 100-mile ultras, multi-stage stuff such as Marathon des Sables while still lifting heavy weights and performing pretty well. And for me, that's testament to my strength training. I've never had a single running injury in my almost 40 years of running. And again, I put that down to the fact that I strength train and I've been lifting weights since the age of 16. Again, I'm not saying you need to go full sort of bodybuilding style or powerlifting style in the gym like I tend to do a lot of the time. However, getting comfortable moving some heavy weights I don't think is a bad thing. So the kind of the whys and the little bit of understanding of the definition of what strength training should look like. But what does that mean practically? what does a strength session look like in the gym? What's the sets, the reps, and all that sort of stuff? Well, because I mentioned about how typically we're going to see more lower reps and less sets for sort of moderate to heavy weights, we can look at anywhere between the sort of the 6 to 12 rep range is a good place to start. So doing 6 to 12 reps of a single exercise in one go, followed by a rest period. And if we're going on the sort of higher end of that scale towards the 12 reps, we could get away with 30 to 60 seconds rest between sets. If we're going more towards the 6 reps and therefore heavier, because obviously as the reps decrease, the load should increase, we can then look at something like 60 seconds to 2 minutes rest between sets. There's a lot of studies to show that by decreasing your rest period, we've not necessarily seen any improvement in overall performance. So what I'm getting at is that we've seen people get just as strong on a 2-minute rest period as they have a 1-minute rest period. So if you feel you need to take a bit longer, you're probably not going to be causing any detriment to your training. So 6 to 12 reps, anywhere between sort of 30 seconds and 2 minutes rest, depending on where you're at on that rep scheme. And obviously if you're relatively new to this sort of stuff, stick to the higher ends and more moderate loads. If you're getting more and more experience, obviously push more towards the lower reps and obviously higher loads. And you can obviously mix in those rep schemes. Each exercise doesn't have to all be sets of 6 or sets of 12. You might find that you use a big lift such as a squat or a deadlift or some other big movement where you use that for the lower reps, and then incorporate some other exercises such as single leg work or glute work, hamstring isolation work, where you then maybe go to some of those higher rep ranges. Again, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here, as long as you're trying to progress overload throughout week to week. So that's your sets and reps. But what about exercise selection? Now, this doesn't need to be overly complex. I like to break it down into movement patterns. So we've got a squat pattern, we've got a hinge pattern, we've got push movements, we've got pull movements, and obviously we've then got some core, we've got some single leg. Pretty much those are kind of the categories that you can break all movements down into on the whole. Yes, there's going to be some that are outside those, but on the whole, we can break it down into that. So if you think to really get some benefit from strength work, you want to be doing at least 2 sessions per week. So you can break that down straight away as session 1, you have some form of squat as your first exercise, then some form of hinge, then a push, then a pull, then a core. That's 5 movements. You might add 2 core, let's say, on that particular session. 6 movements. If you did 6 movements for 3 sets of each, anywhere between that 6 to 12 rep range with a minute to 2 minutes rest in between, you'll be done in less than an hour. Session 2 then could flip that. So you could then go hinge movement to start, so it's a bit heavier compared to session 1 where it was a squat movement to start. Then you could go into some form of squat movement or single leg exercise, then another push, then another pull, and a couple more core. Or you could obviously replace your core for something like heel raises, so we're working a bit on the calf, hence movement patterns are a little bit of an outlier of those categories. But straight away you've got 2 sessions of 6 movements in each, both covering pretty much full body. So that, again, if you're doing 2 sessions or 3 sessions per week, full body is the best bet. So you're getting regular exposure to each muscle group to force that adaptation, that change. And you've got 2 sessions there that are less than an hour in each. And because you're only doing 2 a week, you can spread them out wherever you feel you're going to be able to squeeze them in, whether it's on a run day or whether it's on a day where you're not doing a running session, if you can only fit in 1 session per day. And that's it. That's your strength work. And obviously, when we look at those patterns, so let's say we look at the squat pattern, there's loads of variations in there. There's no one exercise that is the best for running. It's whatever is going to help you move comfortably with decent range of motion and something that you can load up with confidence. If that's a leg press or a leg extension or a barbell back squat, goblet squat, because obviously we can get heavy kettlebells, it doesn't really matter. As long as it's something from that pattern, you're covering your bases. Same with the hinge movement. Whilst I use the term hinge movement, we could also kind of group in stuff that's focusing on the hamstrings, but maybe in a bit more of an isolated nature. But I like things like Romanian deadlifts. And again, we can use them with anything from a kettlebell all the way up to a barbell. We can do it with 2 feet. We can do it with a kickstand variation where one foot's slightly behind the other to just give a bit of a single leg focus, but also allowing for balance. We can go to a single leg deadlift where the one foot completely comes off the ground, so again adding a bit more instability. We can even use things like the hamstring curl machine. As long as you're getting exercises that fit into that bracket, again, you've covered your bases. Obviously, push movements, world's your oyster. Anything that involves pushing, again, self-explanatory. Same with pulling, anything that involves pulling in. So obviously press-ups, bench press, all those good stuff, shoulder presses, all that sort of stuff on the push. Rows, pull-ups, TRX stuff, they all satisfy the pull. Obviously core, again, world's your oyster. Now, with the core stuff, there's been flip-flops between extremes over the years of 1 minute it's all about doing, sit-ups and crunches and this, that and the other, and then it went to what we call core stability, where it was we need to reduce movement at the spine because it's not designed for certain ranges of motion. So then things like dead bugs and bird dogs and all that stuff became the rage. Now there's kind of like a flip again, but it's sort of, some people still hammer the core stability, some people still hammer just the sit-ups and the crunches and all that stuff, and then there's a kind of camp that's in between where it understands that both have utility, but the more movement variability you have, i.e. the more access to ranges of motion you have, the more resilient you're going to be. So if we just did core stability movements where we're not moving our spine, when we go out for trail running and we're put into awkward positions when we're running down hills or running over uneven terrain, we've not accessed those ranges of motion in the gym, so therefore we're more likely to pull something, strain something, or just cause discomfort. So I'm in the camp of, we want a blend of the two. But for me, primarily, I want the core stuff that takes me into ranges of motion and build strength there. So things like rotations, side bends, yes, sit-ups, crunches and all that stuff, leg raises, hanging leg raises, all those good bits and pieces. Exercise we can also load up are even great to then obviously take that strength even further. Dead bugs and all that stuff have their place, especially maybe in early stages of training. But again, just like any other strength exercise, abdominals are muscles just like your biceps and your quads. We want to build strength in those by overloading them with resistance. So again, hundreds of crunches is only going to get you so far. Equally, 5 sets of dead bugs is only going to get you so far. There's got to be some sort of happy medium where we can do a bit of both, and that's what I would certainly recommend when it comes to plugging in the core exercises into your routine. At the moment, I'm really liking doing heavy side bends, so taking decent weight in one hand and literally leaning over to one side. And then utilizing the obliques and the hips to bring that weight back up. But again, there's so many exercises out there. There's no best exercise for any particular situation. It's what suits you at that time and what gives you a challenge and kind of allows you to develop some sort of fitness competency. So that's programming. I'm pretty confident we've covered most stuff there. Incorporating it into your routine. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It really depends on your lifestyle constraints, what time constraints you have, where you're at, obviously in training as well, because that will determine how much strength you may be doing. Are you going to push the weights, etc.? So the final piece of the puzzle then is that programming element. We know how to construct some sessions now, utilizing that full body principle. We know simply week to week we want to be trying to increase the load or maybe add in a couple of reps and stuff, obviously to a point. So the last piece is then fitting it all in. So the gold standard in a running program would be to do your strength work on your hard running days. And I've mentioned this before in my building an ultra running video. So if you're doing a tempo session or some sprints or something like that, let's say in the AM, you then ideally want to do your gym work in the PM. Reason being is then when you do your easy run the next day or you have your day off, it's a full recovery day, or at least an easy run which still helps promote an element of recovery, rather than doing a hard running session on one day and then a hard strength session the next day, which is then going to obviously compromise recovery to a degree. And please, when I say that, I'm not all of a sudden saying you're not going to recover if you don't follow the strength work on your hard running days. This is the gold standard. If your lifestyle doesn't sort of accommodate that, then you have to deal with what you can accommodate, and you will still be able to perform. You will still be able to improve performance. This is just the gold standard, which for most of us everyday runners isn't going to necessarily fit. This is for those that obviously have all the time in the world to train and don't have to worry about work and family and all this sort of stuff. The next one then, if you can't necessarily get the strength work on your hard running days, is to then try and not do your strength work the day after your hard running days or the day before your hard running days. Now, this depends on where you're at in your training. If you're further out from race day and you're trying to improve overall fitness with some sessions that aren't necessarily specific to your goal event, then you might find that actually I need to be in my prime for these harder running sessions, so therefore I'll do the strength work at least the day after to allow for recovery, rather than doing it the day before and compromising that run session. However, if you're in an element of off season where yes, you're still doing some intensity in your runs, but it's not necessarily as focused on building fitness but more maintaining fitness, then you might find, well, actually I'll do my strength session the day before my harder run sessions, knowing that that might cause a little bit of soreness and fatigue in my running session, but I'm still going to get some good quality out of that, and obviously I'll get some great quality out of the strength work. So again, where you put that in depends on where you're at in your training and what your goals are at that time, and it can be flexible. So you might find that one time in your program your strength work does come before a hard run session and you have a bit of soreness or fatigue going into that. At another phase in your run program, they are at least a day after, so that you can really focus on smashing out those higher intensity run sessions. Those are probably the two best options in terms of how to program your strength work. Obviously, failing all that, if you have to program it on the same day as an easy run, again, that's just the way it is. If it has to be just a dedicated session on its own, that's just the way it is. If it has to be the day after a hard run session because that's when you can fit it in, that's just the way it is. The key is you're getting it in. You know, doesn't matter about fitting your lifestyle into some golden routine that someone somewhere has said that's based on some professional runner. It's about what works for you, utilizing those guiding principles that we know we need strength work for all those benefits I mentioned earlier. We know how to construct those sessions, so then we can just try and then fit that into our lifestyle as best as possible. All right. And whilst I'm talking about those lifestyle constraints, I'd argue if you can't fit in two, even if they're 30-minute run sessions, knock a couple of exercises off each session, knock it down to 4 per session. You should be done in about 30 minutes, even with a warm-up. If you can't fit 2 lots of 30 minutes in, I'd argue then, especially if you're getting niggles and injuries and all that stuff all the time, I'd argue then you need to drop a bit of your running and focus on that strength work, at least for a training block of 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, something like that, before you then start maybe dropping some strength work to maintain, and then obviously getting back into your running program. Anyway, I digress. Then the final piece of the programming puzzle is, well, what about as we get close to race day? What about when we get into taper periods and all that good stuff? Now, obviously, again, depending on where you're at in your running program might determine whether or not you continually try and increase the weights you're moving or the complexity of the exercises. It might be as you get closer to your race that you then go into a bit more of a maintenance mode with your strength, so you're not pushing the weights any further than where you're at that point in time, and just maintaining it a couple of times a week so you can focus more on the running. As you get into your peak weeks, you might find that you need to drop the strength work completely to allow you to recover adequately from the increased volume that you potentially might experience when you go into those peak weeks. During the taper phase, you definitely should drop all strength work altogether, because remember, by this point now your training is complete, and obviously strength work will just be detracting from your overall recovery as you're then going into that decreased volume. And then again, post-race, give yourself a bit of recovery time. You then might start introducing another block of strength work where you just get back into the gym for a couple of weeks, deal with the soreness that's inevitably going to come after having a bit of a break, and then go back into a bit of a build phase of your strength work where again you're going to develop and push the weights where you finished up last time and try and take them even further, and just repeat that process again, depending on races, where your taper periods are, your recovery periods and all that stuff. So again, it doesn't have to be a rigid 2 times a week forever. It can ebb and flow just like your running training does, just like your volume does, your intensity. That ebbs and flows depending on where you're on the program, depending on where your goals and your races are. Strength training can match that as well. I think that's a good video there. A bit longer than I was initially thinking it would be, but that's not a bad thing. So yeah, let's put a pin in it there. I think if there's any questions from that, that's enough content there for you guys to try and draw some questions. If you've got any clarifications or questions specific to your needs, please chuck them in the comments. I'll happily answer and give my advice. Obviously, if you are going to ask questions, if you can provide a bit of context as well, because obviously it's hard for me to answer sort of training and programming related questions if I don't understand a little bit about you as an athlete, such as, you know, what you're running at the moment weekly, do you get injured a lot, blah blah blah. Because obviously, you know, if you're injured all the time, your strength work may look very different to someone who doesn't get injured all the time and maybe has a bit more freedom of what they can do in the gym, or a bit more freedom to kind of push themselves a little bit more because they know they can handle it alongside their running. Again, all that's very athlete dependent. The final takeaway with your strength work then is make sure that you do it, make sure that it's challenging, and make sure if you're at a point in your program where the running is the priority, that it doesn't detract from your running. So adjust everything else in the strength routines, weights, sets, reps, recovery times, frequency, adjust them to accommodate the run program as and when required. Okay, cool. Any questions, chuck them in the comments below. I'd really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed my channel while I continue to obviously put out content on helping you as an ultra runner. If you've got any specific topics that you would like me to cover, then just again chuck them in the comments below and I'll start creating videos towards those. I'm going to start looking at creating a couple of videos based on some of the comments previously on a bit of mental toughness and breaking down kind of what typical carbohydrates per hours look like on the nutritional front. So what 30 grams an hour looks like, 40 grams an hour from various different combinations of food and stuff like that, just to give a visual representation as well. But if there's anything else that you want me to chat about, talk about, please drop it in the comments below. If you want to get in touch with me directly, lee@ultramarathonccoach.co.uk is my email. More than happy to answer your questions over email as well. All right, thanks for watching, guys.